Hello and welcome back to our channel. Today, we have a fascinating historical journey ahead, delving into the life and eventual exile of one of the most enigmatic figures in history, Napoleon Bonaparte. If you enjoy content like this, please do subscribe and hit that like button to support the channel. Let's begin with a brief overview of who Napoleon was. Born in Corsica in 1769, Napoleon Bonaparte was a French military general and political leader who emerged during the late 18th and early 19th centuries, playing a pivotal role in the era of the French Revolution. Napoleon's legacy is multifaceted, remembered for his military brilliance, legal reforms, and the profound consequences of the Napoleonic Wars that reshaped Europe. While opinions about him vary, his enduring impact on history is undeniable. Moving on to his later life, despite his early successes in restoring order to France in the early 1800s, the years following his ascent to the throne would be marred by a series of failures that ultimately led to his downfall. One notable endeavor was the Continental System, an attempt to weaken England by urging neutral and allied countries to halt trade with them. Ironically, this backfired for Napoleon and his soon-to-be crippling empire. The Continental System was a grand economic experiment, a masterstroke designed to cripple the British economy. Napoleon's plan was to create a blockade, urging his allies and neutral countries to stop trading with England, essentially making it a no-trade zone for British goods. On paper, it appeared to be a brilliant maneuver. If England couldn't trade with Europe, it would suffer economically, or so the theory went. However, the real story lies in the unintended consequences. The Continental System didn't just hit England, it ricocheted in ways that even Napoleon hadn't foreseen. Firstly, it weakened France's own economy. Many of the goods Europe wanted came from British manufacturers, and without access to these products, industries across the continent started feeling the strain. Secondly, enforcing the Continental System was a Herculean task. Smuggling became rampant, and it was nearly impossible to seal off all trade routes effectively. Lastly, England displayed incredible adaptability. They began seeking out new trading partners around the world, opening up markets in Asia, the Americas, and beyond, which allowed them to weather the storm relatively unscathed. Napoleon's conquest of Spain in 1808, where he installed his brother Joseph as king, proved to be another pivotal moment. The move was ostensibly aimed at further expanding French influence, but it backfired dramatically. To solidify his control, Napoleon installed his older brother Joseph as the King of Spain. However, this decision deeply upset the Spanish people, who had once been allies with France. This marked the beginning of the Peninsular War, which lasted from 1808 to 1814. The conflict turned out to be far costlier than anticipated for the French. While they eventually managed to defeat Spain's military forces, the war became a quagmire. It exposed the extent of Napoleon's land hunger and his desire to exert control over neighboring nations. The Peninsular War proved to be a long, arduous, and costly struggle that drained French resources both in terms of men and materials. The Spanish resistance, fueled by guerrilla warfare tactics, made it nearly impossible for French forces to maintain control over the vast territory they had occupied. As a result, Napoleon was forced to divert valuable resources and troops to maintain his grip on Spain. The war exposed the limits of his imperial ambitions, eroding his support and sowing the seeds of his eventual downfall. One of the most infamous episodes in Napoleon's career was his disastrous invasion of Russia in 1812. Driven by the desire for political advantage and the hope of defeating his Russian adversaries, Napoleon led his Grande Armée into the vast expanse of Russia. However, the campaign was doomed from the start. Harsh weather conditions, particularly the brutal Russian winter, and relentless resistance from the Russian forces made it a nightmarish ordeal. The Russian strategy of employing a scorched earth policy, where they retreated while destroying resources in their wake, left Napoleon's army starving and ill-equipped. The invasion proved to be a logistical nightmare, and it resulted in the loss of hundreds of thousands of Napoleon's men during the 6-month ordeal. This was a severe blow to the strength of the French military and a profound setback for Napoleon's ambitions. The failure in Russia was a glaring demonstration of Napoleon's vulnerability and marked the beginning of a series of defeats. The retreat from Russia shattered the myth of Napoleon's invincibility, and this setback was a major contributing factor to the decline of his empire and the eventual invasion of France by Allied forces in 1814. It was a turning point that ultimately led to his exile to Elba and the first of his abdications. In early 1814, the winds of change swept across Europe as Allied forces, made up of a coalition of powerful nations, entered French territory. This marked the beginning of the end for Napoleon's empire. As these Allied forces advanced steadily toward the heart of France, the city of Paris, Napoleon found himself in a precarious position. His once unassailable grip on power began to slip. The swift advancement of these foreign armies struck fear into the hearts of the French people, who had grown weary of war and upheaval. Napoleon's political support, which had been a formidable force behind his reign, started to wane. His advisors, many of whom had been his staunch allies, began to question the feasibility of his continued rule. They could see the writing on the wall. Napoleon's empire was crumbling, and it was time for a new direction. The pressure on Napoleon to abdicate his throne grew ever more intense. The political landscape in France was shifting rapidly, and it was clear that holding on to power was no longer tenable. Even his most loyal generals and ministers, who had stood by his side through numerous military campaigns, now urged him to step down. The events of early 1814 marked a dramatic shift in the fortunes of Napoleon Bonaparte. His meteoric rise to power was giving way to a stark and dramatic fall. The once indomitable emperor now faced the prospect of relinquishing his throne and dealing with the consequences of his actions. After his abdication in 1814, Napoleon was exiled to the remote island of Elba. As he faded into the backdrop of European politics, the Bourbon royal family, which had ruled France prior to Napoleon's ascent, returned to power. It seemed that the era of the Corsican military genius had reached its conclusion. However, in a twist of fate that would go down in history, Napoleon made a daring escape from Elba in February 1815. This escape was a testament to his charisma and ability to rally supporters, as he managed to regain his influence and authority in what became known as the 100 Days. This was one of the most audacious comebacks in history, as the world watched in disbelief. With his return to France, Napoleon sought to revive his empire and reign, but his renewed ambition and power faced a formidable obstacle in the form of a coalition of European nations determined to prevent his return to glory. This set the stage for the legendary Battle of Waterloo in 1815, a battle that would decide the fate of Europe and Napoleon himself. On one side, Napoleon led his battle-hardened troops, and on the other, a coalition force made up of British, Prussian, Dutch, and Belgian forces united to halt his advance. The Battle of Waterloo was a brutal and epic confrontation. Napoleon's tactical genius was evident, but he was ultimately defeated by a combination of factors, including the determination of his adversaries, the leadership of the Duke of Wellington, and the timely arrival of Prussian reinforcements led by General Blücher. The battle ended in his defeat and marked a turning point in history. Following his defeat at Waterloo, Napoleon faced his second abdication. This time, there was no chance for another escape. He was exiled to the remote and isolated island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic. This final chapter in Napoleon's life marked the definitive end of his rule and ambitions. St. Helena, with its rugged landscape and isolation, was a far cry from the grandeur of his past conquests. His world had shrunk from the vast empires he had once commanded to a small, windswept island. In exile, Napoleon settled down to a life of routine. He got up late, breakfasting about 10 a.m., but seldom went out. He was free to go anywhere on the island, so long as he was accompanied by an English officer, but he soon refused to comply. From 7 o'clock to 8 p.m., Napoleon had dinner, after which a part of the evening was spent in reading aloud. Napoleon liked to hear the classics. Then they played cards. About midnight, Napoleon went to bed. Some of his time was devoted to learning English, and he eventually began reading English newspapers. He also had a large number of French books sent from Europe, which he read attentively and annotated. St. Helena had a healthful climate, and Napoleon's food was good, carefully prepared, and plentiful. His inactivity undoubtedly contributed to the deterioration of his health. He had many reasons to be upset, one of them being his second wife's Marie-Louise's silence, which left him unaware of her relationship with Austrian officer Adam Graf von Neipperg, whom she secretly married. He also had no updates on his son, the former King of Rome, now living in Vienna as the Duke of Reichstadt. Napoleon showed the first signs of illness at the end of 1817. He seems to have had an ulcer or a cancer of the stomach, and it is unclear if Napoleon's disease was curable at all, even by 21st century methods. From the beginning of 1821, the illness became rapidly worse. From March, Napoleon was confined to bed. In April, he dictated his last will. "I wish my ashes to rest on the banks of the Seine, in the midst of that French people which I have loved so much. I die before my time, killed by the English oligarchy and its hired assassins." On May 5th, he spoke a few coherent phrases: France, Army, Head of the Army, Josephine. He died at 5:49 p.m. on that day, not yet 52 years old. His body was dressed in his favorite uniform, that of the Chasseurs de la Garde. The funeral was conducted simply but with due propriety in the Rupert Valley, where Napoleon had sometimes walked, beside a stream in which two willows were reflected. The stone covering his tomb bore no name, only the words, "Si gait," here lies. Napoleon Bonaparte's legacy endures for his lasting impact on European culture and politics. His life was marked by a meteoric rise and a dramatic fall, and his time in exile on St. Helena was a poignant chapter in the story of this iconic historical figure. Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed, make sure to like and subscribe for more to come.